Hi, welcome to the podcast. We're going to talk about our fixed overhead variances. And so in this podcast, we're going to talk about how we develop the rate and then how we analyze the variances between spending and production variances. And then we'll look to see how the variable and fixed overhead variances can be compared in the same type of a chart. So I'm kind of using the same data that we've used throughout the prior podcasts. In this case, we have this four-step process where we develop the fixed overhead to cost rates, just like we did with the variable. So we pick our period of time, which is going to be 12 months. We select our cost allocation basis, and we're going to use machine hours, just like we did with variable. And so we're making jackets, as you recall, so it's 0.4 machine hours to create one jacket, and so we're going to use 57,600 machine hours to make 144,000 jackets in the year. Then we have our budgeted fixed costs, which in this case is 3,312,000, and so we divide those just like we did before, and we come up with a rate of 5750 per machine hour is how much we're going to allocate our fixed overhead costs. So to summarize, right, 0.4 hours per jacket. The fixed overhead rate is $57.50 per hour. So $23 of fixed overhead is going to get allocated to every jacket. And one final thing to think about, so we're doing $3.3 million for the year. That's $276,000 for each month. So let's look at the variances. So our fixed overhead flexible budget variance is the difference between our actual cost, our actual fixed overhead, and what our flexible budget amount was. We're going to see in a second that's the same as the spending variance. So let's look at this roadmap for our fixed costs. As you recall, when we have previous looked at either our direct variances or even our variable cost variances, we tended to break this out into two categories. At our highest level, we would hold volume constant and change the cost to see what the spending variances were, or we would hold the cost constant and look at the difference in volume to see what, let's say, an efficiency variance was. Well, we don't have that issue when it comes to fixed costs because our flexible budget is the same amount of fixed costs as our static budget, because it doesn't change. So when we thought we were going to do 12,000 jackets and we budgeted 276,000 for the month, well, that's still 276,000 even if we only did 10,000 jackets, because it's a fixed cost. So we never have a variance between those two. And so what you can see is the spending variance and the flexible budget variance are in fact the same variance. Now, we will get to a production volume variance. This is probably the most complicated of all of the variances. Let me talk about that in a second. So our spending variance, again, is the difference between the actual costs incurred and the flexible budget amount. So the spending variance and the flexible budget variance are the same, and again, the reason for this is because volume, we don't have a measure where we hold cost constant and look at the change in volume when it relates to fixed costs. The production volume variance, this is the difference between what we had budgeted for our fixed cost overhead and how much fixed cost overhead we should have incurred based on our actual level of output. This is sometimes, there's a few terms here, actually a couple of these I've never heard. Denominator level variance or output level overhead variance. I've never heard those two terms. The term that I've commonly heard in practice is absorption variance, So the production volume variance might sometimes be referred to as an absorption variance. And the reason I want you to think about it this way, as we are producing products, they are absorbing an amount of fixed overhead. So we have $276,000 of overhead for the month. If we produce 276,000 jackets, you would see that each jacket absorbed $1 of overhead. If we did 27,600 jackets, then each jacket would have to absorb $10 of overhead. Now, where the problem we run into is we don't have our pricing based on that. Remember, in this example, our pricing was based on $23 of overhead per jacket. So if we are not producing many jackets as we thought, we aren't absorbing through our cost structure all of the overhead we needed to absorb. We're going to see that here in a second. So the production volume variance. This is a difficult one to interpret. I hope I've explained it well enough to you. The idea again is that fixed costs remain the same, and so as our volume goes up, we absorb more fixed costs, and therefore we become more profitable. If our volume goes down, we don't absorb enough fixed costs, and therefore we are less profitable, or we have unfavorable variances. So, as this example, we actually incurred $285,000 of fixed overhead costs for the month. Our budgeted amount was $276,000. So we have an unfavorable spending variance, which is of course the same as the flexible budget variance. However, in our absorption or production volume variance, we should have used we should have incurred 0.4 hours machine hours per unit times 10,000 units times 5750, meaning that we would that we produced enough to absorb $230,000 of overhead. We obviously wanted to absorb $276,000 of overhead, so we end up with a $46,000 unfavorable production volume variance. Meaning that had we had perfect knowledge, our rate would not have been 5750. In fact, it would have been much higher than that, so that we would have absorbed 276,000. In this case, we didn't have that knowledge, obviously, and we end up with an unfavorable production volume variance. Okay, so how do we integrate these two variances? Well, let's kind of put them all on the same chart. So we have our actual over here, and we have our flexible budget here. And you can see these are the same, right? The headings are the same on each one of these, both variable and fixed. So the flexible budget, and then how much is allocated, should be allocated based on our budgeted allowances times the actual input. Well, that's the same as the flexible budget for for variable, and you can see that those are the same. So we never have a variance between these two. So when we did the flexible budget, we didn't even look at this, right? Because there's no variance here. So we just looked at these. We just looked at these three right here. Okay, so when we're doing the fixed overhead, now we do have a variance between these two, and we don't have one here. This is a way, especially if you were like trying to build one of these charts in Excel, this is a good way to kind of lay it out and know, as you sort of plug your numbers in to come up with your answers, where you should find a variance, where you should not find a variance. All right, and that concludes our podcast for fixed overhead variances.